Fantastic. Hi. Thanks everybody for coming. So welcome to MRSS's How to Write a Thesis event. So lots of you, this is the time of year when everything's starting to come together. It's also the time of year for some students where they feel that they haven't collected much information and they're starting to get a bit worried about whether or not they're going to actually have anything to write about. So we'll come back to that a little bit about the end. That's pretty normal. There's always some students who encounter technical issues throughout the year who don't end up with a huge amount of data, but inevitably those students still end up with really pretty fantastic theses. Okay, so actually having data or showing significant differences is not a prerequisite for writing an excellent honours thesis. Okay, so that's the first thing to say. All right, so we'll go through some of the technicalities around the honours thesis first. So in terms of the organisation, this is in the course guide. So all the information, you need to go back and look at the course guide, look at the marking rubric and look at the organisational requirements that we've listed in the course guide. Very briefly, it's broken down most of the time into these headings. So you'll have an abstract. We've put a strict word limit on it this year, around 500 words. And what we're hoping is that you'll be able to copy the abstract from the thesis and import it directly into the template for the yearbook that we generate at the end of the year. So all of your abstracts will get imported directly into that yearbook. Well, we will ask you to copy-paste it into the template for the yearbook. So 500-word abstract, that basically summarises the entire study. Again, you'd split it into these brief headings, a few words about the introduction, a few sentences about the methods, a few sentences about the results, and then a few sentences concluding the data. So it's very similar to a conference abstract, about twice as long as a standard. So it should summarise the entire study. The introduction, the literature review that you've already written. So we'll move on to that. We usually have a formal methods chapter and a formal results chapter. Sometimes some students might have a couple of chapters, so they might have a methods and a results and then another methods and another results. So it just depends on the format of the thesis. And then you bring it all together at the end to discuss your findings. So in terms of the literature review, most of you won't have to do very much to the literature review that you've already written. Do go back. Now, some of your projects will have changed direction since you wrote that. So do go back and revisit the literature review. So I've said here, keep that introductory paragraph. So I suggested when write the literature review session that you have an introductory paragraph that summarises basically all the key points in the introduction. You should still have that, even though you now have an abstract. Okay, so keep that one paragraph introduction to the thesis in there. Review it's dated, so there might be some key publications that have come out during the year that you might want to include in there. Revise it. Some of you might need to shorten it to make sure that the entire thesis still fits within the word limit. So your literature review is up to 7,500 words, and your total thesis is up to 15,000 words. So you might think about cutting the literature down so that you've got more space at the end to discuss your findings. Definitely go back and look at your examiner's feedback. Look at what they thought was good. Look at the things that they misunderstood or that they asked for greater clarity around, and make sure that you address those concerns. Because in 99% of cases, the person who examined your literature review, the two people that examined your literature review, will also examine your thesis. It's really important that you take note of the things that they suggested. It doesn't mean you need to do everything that they suggest, but you definitely want to, if you don't do what they've asked, then you need to craft it somehow as to why you might not have done that. So as an example, I had one of my honours students a couple of years ago. We're working on a protein that's nearly all of the literature review suggests that it promotes cancer, and there's a couple of papers that suggest that it inhibits cancer. So the honours student had written obviously a lengthy part of the literature review about the evidence showing that it was positively associated with the presence of tumours and severity of tumours. Then there was, probably 1 or 2 paragraphs talking about the evidence that the couple of papers where it wasn't associated with tumour proliferation. In fact, it looked like it might be acting as a tumour suppressor. So the examiner said, well, you haven't given equal weighting. You've specifically selected the papers that support your hypothesis, and you haven't given equal weighting to the evidence that suggests that it's a tumour suppressor rather than a tumour promoter. But actually there's about 50 papers that suggest that it promotes tumour formation. There's only about 3 papers that suggest that it could be acting as a tumour suppressor. So it wouldn't have made sense to put equal amount of text on those 2 things. What we instead did was she just inserted really one sentence to say the vast majority of papers suggest that it is positively associated with tumour formation, and brackets 47 papers, and then at the end there are, however, a few papers that contradict this where it suggests that it's a tumour suppressor. 3 papers thus far have indicated. So that made it very clear to the examiner that we weren't artificially weighting the evidence in our favour. We were actually genuinely presenting the amount of evidence for both of those cases. Okay, so that's an example where you don't need to do what they've asked, but if we hadn't made those changes, then the examiner would have come back with the exact same criticism. Okay, so just look at the feedback that they've given you, think about it, talk to your supervisor about it, because sometimes your supervisor will disagree with what the examiner's suggested, and sometimes it's because the examiner's misunderstood something. And if that's the case, then you need to make sure that they're not going to misunderstand it again in the final submission. Okay, so update, revise, shorten if necessary, particularly make sure that you clarify any misunderstandings that the examiners had. Some of you might have published a review article based upon your literature review. If that's the case, then you should insert a declaration page right at the start stating that a modified version of it has been submitted for publication or accepted for publication. Okay, that's to really prevent yourself from plagiarism, self-plagiarism. Turnitin, go back and look at your Turnitin reports from the literature review as well, and look at where you had matches. So there were quite a few things that I picked up when I looked at your Turnitin reports, and I probably should come back and email you a couple of you about them. I think most of it just use it as feedback on yourself. Yeah, if you've got extensive matches, then you need to go back and revise anywhere. Actually, none of you had extensive matches because I would have spoken to you already. But where you did have stretches of text where there were reasonable amount of matching, then make sure you revise those stretches of text. What I discovered this year when I was going through it, one person had used single quotation marks around a quote, and that was picked up by Turnitin. Turnitin didn't recognise that that was a quoted section of text. So if you're going to quote a section of text, particularly around a definition, then you need to use double quotation marks, not single quotation marks. Your Moodle should be set up so that it doesn't pick up your literature review as a match. So it should look like you don't need to revise every single thing that you've written in your literature review. Some of you might need to adjust your aims and hypothesis if they've changed since you started. Remember that the aim and the hypothesis have to be really specific to what you've actually done. You can have a global aim and a hypothesis, but you should have an aim and a hypothesis that directly matches, so a specific aim and a hypothesis that specifically matches exactly what you did, because we often get criticism back from examiners. The aim was to do this, but actually they didn't do that. They did something slightly differently. Okay, so really make sure that you check that you have actually done or attempted to do what you said you were going to do in the aim. The methods should be sufficiently detailed that somebody else can directly replicate them. Okay, so the next student that comes to work in that research group, if they want to adopt the exact same methods that you used, they should be able to pick up your thesis and essentially perform the following study using the exact same criteria that you were using during your study. It's definitely more detailed than published paper. Okay, published paper, we really significantly abbreviate the methods that we include. If you've done statistics, really important to include a separate statistics section. Be absolutely clear. This is, again, one of the things examiners are really often spend a lot of focus on, is looking at what statistics you did and did you justify the statistics that you used. We will argue, we talked about stuff here, we will often argue about what statistics should be used for different studies. As long as you justify the specific stats that you did, that's the important thing. Okay, they might suggest that you could do it differently, but they shouldn't really be deducting marks from you for that. They could make a comment about it. Obviously, if you've done a qualitative study, which some students do, then you wouldn't include a statistics section, but you'd include how you've actually analysed, what sort of themes you've used to analyse that data. In terms of the results section nearly always starts off with a summary of your study group. So if it was a human study, you might start off saying something like a total of A participants during the time. There were a total of A participants that attended the clinic during this time period. B weren't eligible or weren't approached. C participants were lost to follow-up. A certain number of participants were excluded. So the final number that were analysed in this thesis was this. Okay, so if you've done a human study, they will nearly always start off with something that summarise the human information. If you've done, and then you need to, so if it was an animal study, then you would have something similar, usually a little bit less detailed than that. But you might say we used this many animals, however, you know, only a certain proportion of them got pregnant or some died during the study, something like that. Then you summarise the characteristics of the final group. So what are the most important things, features about the 2 or 3 different groups that you were comparing? So were your control group and your study group, what was their mean age, mean and standard error or standard deviation of the age group between your 2 different groups? What was their sex, what was their weight, etc. To show that everything, what you're usually aiming for is to show that everything was the same except for the outcomes that you were actually studying. And if they weren't the same, then in your discussion you'll need to say that this is what my results suggested. However, it's important to note that I actually had 60% males in my treatment group and I only had 40% males in my control group. Be aware of what fundamental differences there might be between your groups that you hadn't intended there to be present when you initially designed the study. The results section, it's really brief. Usually in a results section there's no actual interpretation of the data. Most of the time it's literally just stating what you found. So it will be statements like subjects that received this treatment had significantly higher blood pressure, and then you might state what the blood pressure was for your treatment group in comparison to the group that received the placebo, and then you'd state what the placebo's blood pressure was. Okay, so just a straight out, pure statement of the facts, not interpreting anything from them, just stating them, and then referring to a figure or a graph that might also contain that information. You need to state, if you're putting values in there, you need to state what those values actually are. Is it the mean plus or minus the standard error? Is it the mean plus or minus the standard deviation? Is it a p-value? Is it confidence intervals, etc.? So you need to really state exactly what it is that you've done in there. Often you'll restate them in the methods or figures. If you've used a number of different statistical tests, and it's always safe to restate that in your figure legends, because it avoids the examiner having to go back and double check. The idea is to make the life easy for your examiner. Yep, the less work the examiner has to do, the more likely they are to like your thesis. Make sure that you refer. It's amazing how many theses we get to examine and the students stated the results and they put in all these beautiful figures and graphs, but they haven't referred to them. Okay, so you state the findings and then you put bracket figure X or table 3. Something like that. So do refer to them in that results section. As I said, you don't normally interpret or discuss those results. You just state what they are. You don't normally interpret them unless that informed the next step of the project. So that most common example of that is projects that involve molecular biology, where you might try one particular treatment, and if that did or didn't have an effect, then if it did have an effect, then the next step you did was this, and if it didn't have an effect, then the next step you did was this. So in those sorts of projects, you do usually include 1 or 2 sentences. Because this happened, we decided to do this next. Okay, that's in most cases, that's the main sort of projects where you would include some degree of discussion in the results section itself. If you're including photographs, so some of you might want to include photographs of patients or injuries or something elsewhere, then you need to make sure that you're actually approved to use those. Your thesis is considered a publication, so you do need to use it. Make sure that you've got the appropriate approval to use those images. So refer in the Moodle site, we've got the AMA guidelines to the use of clinical images. The figures should stand alone. So that means you need a figure number and a figure title and a figure legend. Often students will just put the figure number and the figure title. That's not enough. You should be able to look at that figure without reading any of the text in the results and absolutely understand what that figure is showing you. So I've got a couple of examples here. Now I will put this PDF up on the Moodle website. Okay, so you'll be able to refer back to these things that I'm suggesting. So this is an example. Now I've actually purposely chosen some fairly difficult data to present so that you get an idea of the type of information that you need to include for something that's fundamentally might be difficult for the examiners to understand. So this is an example of what I would call raw data, so representative data or individual data or descriptive data. I've got 2 sections of lung here, and you can see that they're labelled A and B, so I'll be able to tell if the figure legend will need to say exactly what I'm showing in A and what I'm showing in B. You can see that there's some arrows here, and you can see that there's some size scale bars here. So the figure title should just be a very brief statement of what you're showing. So in this case, the figure is collagen localization in ventilated and unventilated lungs. Then I state that it's a representative image, meaning it's raw data. So representative image, low power, the scale bar equals 50 microns. So this little black line here is 50 microns. The images of lung sections from 1 ventilated in B and 1 unventilated in A fetus. Okay, so it's immediately clear. The first sentence says exactly